Welcome back, Red Wave America, to another discussion video. Today I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to be interviewing someone on the Civil War. So our first episode in this series, I actually did that with a guy named Josh. Today, fast forward 19 episodes later, I'm going to be doing it with his friend named Scott. So, for the introduction, the Civil War history. I'm just going to ask him questions about Civil War, why he's interested in it. And so let's first have him introduce himself.
Howdy, my name's Scott. I've been interested in Civil War history for about the last, 5 years. Mainly got into it through reading about. I'm mostly into it through the military side. Started reading about it. Kind of got into it through a variety of things. I was interested in line warfare in general, the Napoleonic era, and figured European history, it's a little bit more distant to what's here, and you can't so easily visit battlefields of a lot of those sorts of battles of the Napoleonic era, and feel a lot more closer to the Civil War. A lot of my own ancestors fought on both sides of the conflict. I'm currently studying and attempting to become a military historian, and that's sort of my background. I'm also interested in World War II and just military history in general, but the Civil War is my main area of interest.
Okay, thank you. So for point one, you kind of already answered that question, what got you into Civil War? So you answered that. Let me just ask you this question for the first question of the day. Which side would you have been on and why?
Well, that's a complicated question because my sympathies lie kind of with both sides. I support the North in what they fought for in terms of preserving the Union and trying to keep the country together. They, I think, fought for a good cause in that regard. Then again, I do not support the Republican Party in their attempts to tear the country apart over simply the issue of slavery. I think that in a lot of ways, the Civil War could have been prevented, but the Republican Party sought not to do that. As for the South, I do sympathize with them in their cause for independence. I don't believe secession is necessarily illegal, but I do sympathize with the South. That said, I'm a Northerner. Most of my ancestors were from the North and fought for the North in the Civil War. I think of who I am today, where I was born. I was born in a small town in Michigan, and all you have to do is go to local cemeteries and stuff like that, and you see still today graves of Civil War veterans, and every single person from where I was born fought for the North. In specifically the 22nd Michigan Infantry and the 10th Michigan Infantry, they fought for the North. So with that in mind, and the great Civil War historian Shelby Foote said this, he was asked the very same question. The only difference between me and him is that he was born in a rural town in Tennessee, And so he was asked, which side of the Civil War would he have fought on? And he answered, well, I think of where I was born and who I am. I would have fought for the South. Well, for me, the answer is the same, but I probably would have fought for the North.
Oh, okay.
So I don't base that off of my political opinions. I base that simply off of where I'm from, because that's what most of those men fought, who fought and enlisted. They enlisted on the behalf of their own states, and they volunteered. If you were from the North, you volunteered to preserve the Union, and if you were from the South, you volunteered to fight for state sovereignty and the independence of the South. So, you know, that's how I would answer that question.
Okay. What is the most interesting thing you like about the Civil War?
Um, well, that's kind of a complicated thing. I would say, I mean, the differences between, specifically looking at the generals of both sides, the differences between northern and southern generals, because there definitely was, they were definitely of a different class. You can even just look at them and they kind of look different. Um, and there's a variety of reasons for that. The southern generals, for the most part, were of, especially the ones from Virginia, were of an aristocratic class. You know, they came from plantation families. Um, if you look at Robert E. Lee, or you look at Richard Ewell, or any of these, famous generals, specifically in the Army of Northern Virginia, they are of a very specific class of people. In the North, it was different. In the North, a lot of these people were businessmen. They were career military officers, but they weren't from these long-standing military families. They were more from uh, these kind of business families, rich in different ways. The southern families were very rich from cotton. Uh, the northern businessmen were rich more from industry. So there's that difference. Another difference is, if you actually look at how many southern generals died during the war and compare them to how many Union generals died in the war, it's disproportionate. A lot more northern generals, a lot more southern generals died during the war than northern generals. And there's a variety of reasons for that, but kind of it's speculated, especially with a lot of Southerners who come from Scots-Irish families, that there was kind of a ingrained soldier-like spirit in a lot of Southerners of Scots-Irish ancestry, um, to fight and die in wars. So you have a lot of generals, specifically Stonewall Jackson and Jeb Stuart, both of whom died during the war, both of whom came from Scots-Irish families. Um, they came from kind of a different breed, like I said. Whereas a lot of northern generals were actually immigrants. There were a lot of German generals in the north. German generals, Irish generals, even Polish and Russian generals. You didn't really see that many of those in the South. There were a couple notable examples, Patrick Cleburne being one, but there weren't so many foreign generals in the South. And I think you can kind of see the differences between Northern society and Southern society just by looking at that. And I think that kind of also goes to prove that the differences between North and South were not just regarding the existence of slavery. It was much deeper than that, and it went to a lot of other issues besides that.
Yeah. Um, this question I didn't really write down, but real quick, what what were the differences you're saying about the cultures of each side, North and the South?
Difference between cultures? Well, it really depends on, because, there is no singular Southern culture.
Right.
You have Virginia, which was plantation aristocrats, with long-standing ties to the founding fathers, which is very different, of course, to the culture you had in somewhere like Louisiana, where that culture was, more towards the French, Creole, and Cajun side of things, and they had the similar thing, and yeah, they had aristocrats and they had plantation culture, but it was a different kind of plantation culture. And this is throughout the entire South. And it's kind of, I think, the reason you have these differences in the South, outside of just Louisiana, because Louisiana is kind of the obvious example, the obvious outlier. But somewhere in like why Tennessee is so different from Virginia is because a large part of the South during the time of the American Revolutionary War um, was still frontier, even Georgia, which, while officially one of the 13 colonies, was completely undeveloped. Like, there was pretty much nobody living in Georgia. During the Civil
Right.
War, the state of Florida was still, for the most part, frontier as well. Nobody lived in southern Florida. Only portions of northern Florida were occupied and settled. And most of what was going on in northern Florida was cattle. Uh, they specifically raised beef, which is kind of a part of Florida's history that isn't really well known. But
Wow.
um, the Army of Northern Virginia, the principal army of the Confederacy, received most of their beef from the state of Florida. Whereas in the North, most of, especially New England, because when you say the North, there are two different distinct, actually three, I'd say, distinct cultures in the North. You have New England, which was
Right.
completely settled by the time of the American Revolution. Um, and you have sort of the central northern states, Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland. If you consider Maryland a northern state, I wouldn't. I'd consider it a southern state. Which that culture had a lot more foreign influence because there was a large portion of Germans and um, Dutch and other groups that kind of settled in that area. So they had kind of their own unique culture. And then the Midwest, which was similarly to the South in a large degree. By the time of the Civil War, certain parts of the Midwest were still completely unsettled, specifically like Minnesota, which during the Civil War had a large Indian outbreak where the Sioux went and pillaged through the state. So some of the North was still frontier, but like I said, there's no singular Northern culture and there's no singular Southern culture. There's these different regions in both, but the two domineering ones were the Virginia aristocrats and the New England Puritans, I guess you could say. And I don't say Puritan necessarily in a negative way, as a lot of people would. I like the Puritan culture quite a bit, but it definitely was still kind of present in New England culture. And
Right.
so by the time of the Civil War, these two cultures are kind of opposed to each other because the New England culture started looking down towards both the institution of slavery and kind of looking up towards big business and industrialization, whereas the South was looking towards industrializing, but they weren't so quick with it, and they weren't very in favor of high tariffs and stuff like that. Um, whereas they also kind of still obviously supported the institution of slavery. So you have
Right.
these two kind of opposing cultures because of those two differences, those two major differences. They also had two completely different opinions on politics. The New Englanders supported centralization. They were the descendants of the Federalists. John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, whereas the
Right.
Southerners were the descendants of the Anti-Federalists for the most part, like Thomas Jefferson. So
That would have
in
been
those two,
The Democrat Republican Party is what they called themselves.
yeah,
Yeah.
and so those two factions, had been kind of competing with each other since the birth of the Republic. Uh, they of course opposed each other in a large degree. So you had those two factions that were always at each other's neck over that issue, the issue of federalization, and like, or rather centralization. I mean, and consolidating of power, whereas the South was more for states' rights and local government, not so much centralization. The South, to a large degree, opposed things like internal improvements, funding, uh, private enterprise and building railroads and stuff. They weren't opposed to building railroads, but they were opposed to the government funding it. Whereas the North was very behind that, but that wasn't universal either. There were Southerners like Alexander Stephens who did support internal improvements, but uh, there was definitely a divide in just the political culture of New England and the Virginia aristocrats, and those two cultures were the main opposing ones. The Midwest wasn't so influential. A lot of Midwesterners themselves were kind of descendants of a lot of Southerners, Virginians. They were also descendants of New Yorkers. But the New Yorkers also weren't so um, opposed to the South um, as was New England. It was just New England and Virginia that were kind of always at each other's necks.
Right. What did you think about the South defending state rights? Like, do you agree that for their actions they did not want big government; they wanted small government and their rights? Do you agree with that, or did you
Do
agree with it
I?
more?
Do I? Oh, um, well, like I said, I sympathize with both sides
Right.
because this was a debate that kind of again began at the beginning of the Republic, and it never really died. You had these again two opposing sides at each other's necks, but that debate is kind of intrinsic, or rather, kind of um, it's always been there in American culture. I think it's something that we should kind of embrace as a big part of our history. Um, and it's a tragedy that divide ended in a war that killed 600,000 Americans. But which side do I support? Um, I side more with the South on the issue of centralization. I'm not. I I, I wouldn't like agree with Jeffersonian politics in the modern day for obvious reasons. But I kind of would want a blend of the two, if that would make sense. I
Yeah.
support like for things like healthcare and stuff like that. I think those are issues that should be completely left to the states. I
Hmm.
think making laws. I don't think there should be federal laws, especially in things like guns and such. But
Yeah.
those sorts of things should be left to the states. Same with abortion. I think those are issues that should also be left to the states. But I think in terms of other things like standing military, this was another one of those big sort of opposing things between North and South. I agree with a long-standing military. I think, especially in the modern day, you absolutely need a standing army.
Like a federal, you mean like a
Yeah,
federal
yeah.
military unit? Yeah, I agree with that part. Yeah, but yeah,
You
for
saw the
me,
ineffectiveness of the militia system in the War of 1812, and if it was ineffective even then, it definitely would be ineffective now.
yeah, were they divided in the War of 1812? The states.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there were militias, like I think it was the Pennsylvania militia, refused to march into Canada and refused to participate in the invasion of Canada, which caused massive problems for our troops that marched north. They got defeated. So yeah, it caused a lot of divides. between the states, and because they would refuse to cooperate with the standing federal army that was, which was only like a few thousand men at the time.
For me, where I would stand, I lean more Confederate. However, I would be neutral if I was actually there. But because of state rights, I'm against slavery. Like, I'm anti-racism by far, but I'm also very, very pro state rights. Not big government. I'm very pro small government. So
Yeah.
that's what I probably would have stood. I don't know if you agree to that to an extent. Yeah.
Well, like I said, the one issue that I do agree with the North on is that the Republic should remain together. I don't agree
Right.
with. I think secession was legal. I don't think that. I think there were other ways that the North could have brought the South back into the Union, but I don't. I don't support going to war over the issue of secession. But at the same time, it was the Republican Party that pushed us to the brink of that and pushed us over. And once it started, yeah, I do support the North because I do want the Republic to remain together.
Yeah. So, what do history books today don't like? What do they not tell us about the Civil War? What are some things that they hide from the public?
Um, well, a lot of the older historians they would tell the truth for the most part. It's kind of a very recent thing where the issue of what the South fought for and why they went to war that kind of gets obscured.
Mhm.
Um, they don't talk about, or at least they try to hide some of the real reasons behind why the South went to war. I mean, they they cast it all under this issue, the singular word, slavery, but they don't explain why. They don't explain the why of slavery. Why was slavery the issue here? Um, so there's a lot of things that go into that. Like, for one, John Brown's rape in in the 1850s, just before the beginning of the Civil War, um, where a lunatic armed armed to the teeth with a band of what you could call terrorists uh, barged their way into a federal arsenal with the intention of starting essentially a race war. Um, and understandably, the South is outraged um, by this. In the North, this is celebrated as an act of liberation or an attempt of liberation, and John Brown is lifted to the level of being a martyr and a hero, especially by those people in the Republican Party. They sing the song John Brown's Body and, lift him up to the level of almost sainthood. Um, of course, in the South, to the South, this man, what he did, he killed U.S. soldiers. He, um, held hostage several people. He he shot up almost the entire town of Harper's Ferry, and he was being celebrated as a hero in the North. And even worse than that, two of the participants of the raid escaped into Pennsylvania, and the state of Pennsylvania refused to return those people back to the state of Virginia for trial, which was a violation of the clause of the Constitution, the Fugitive Justice Clause, which requires if a criminal escapes into one state, he is required to be returned to the state in which he committed the crime for trial. And the state of Pennsylvania refused.
Oh.
So that's one. It's kind of the North more pushing about this issue of slavery to the point where they're willing to commit horrendous violence and support horrendous violence over the issue. I won't say the North in a broad sense, but especially these New England abolitionists who were kind of stroking the flames of civil unrest, as most would put it. This in the South prompted the South to start forming up militias. A lot of those militias would later become regiments in the Confederate Army because they were worried about a similar thing happening again. Beyond that, there was the issue of slaves who were escaping from the South into the North. They were in the Constitution. There's a clause in the Constitution which states that if a slave or person bound to labor escapes from one state into another, that the state that they escaped into must return them. Well, several states, including Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, a lot of the New England states, were refusing to follow that. They were refusing to return these people back to the South, which, again, was a violation of the Constitution. Southern politicians, went to the Supreme Court over this, and the Supreme Court ruled in their favor with the Dred Scott decision, but the northern states still refused to follow by that. They were in open violation of the Constitution. Beyond that, there was the issue of the territories out west, specifically Kansas. The issue was the South, during the Mexican-American War, felt that they had more right to those territories because during the Mexican-American War, Southerners disproportionately fought compared to Northerners. And so, like I said, they felt they had more of a right to those territories out west.
Right.
And, well, what happened in Kansas was a bunch of armed men, John Brown included, went into the state and started causing civil unrest and forced those people who supported the Democratic Party, and by extension, some of them did support slavery, were kicked out by these free soilers. They thought Kansas should be a free soil state. During that, John Brown entered the house of the Doyle family and hacked up father and I think 2 sons with broadswords, and right in front of their mother and their youngest son. That tells you what kind of man this was over their political belief. They didn't even own slaves, by the way. They were just Democrats. They voted for the Democratic Party. So, again, that was kind of the violence that was being carried out against these people in Kansas. And on top of that, when the war first began in Texas, the U.S. military completely pulled out of the state of Texas, which allowed for a massive Indian raid to form, and bandits were running rampant throughout the state, which the United States military was bound by the Constitution to defend the state of Texas. So the state of Texas was forced, essentially, to secede. So there were a lot of issues. Some of them do, of course, relate to the issue of slavery. Another issue was, like I said, political representation. Once Kansas became a state, a free state, which had Republican support, the Democratic Party, and by extension the South, lost a lot of its political power. And the way they saw it in the South was, if we are to remain sovereign, and if we wish not to be ruled by a sectional party, as they termed it, well, then we have to leave. We have to get out of here. We cannot stay in the Union like this. So they were essentially, by all accounts, forced out of the Union. They could not remain in the Union and maintain their own sovereignty. Their political power would have been lost. They would have been stripped of most of that, and they could not remain in the Union. They just could not. And it's what happened to them after the war. Their predictions were right, especially in the immediate. their predictions were largely correct. If not, things weren't worse for them than they thought they would. So yeah, I think that's the biggest thing that's kind of left out. It's like, why did the South secede? Why did they leave the Union? Well, it wasn't just like a decision they made out of nowhere. It's because they kind of had to. If you look at the 1860 election, Abraham Lincoln would have won that election, even if the South, I think if I did the math, even if the South, even if they all voted for Breckinridge, the entirety of the South voted for Breckinridge, and they all combined their vote, and then you add some of the Midwestern states, like Michigan, and some of the, even if you add all those electoral votes together, there was no way that Breckinridge would have won the election. There was no way the South could keep their political power. Because the North was, of course, in every election going forward, going to unite and vote for the Republican Party. The Democratic Party, and by extension the South, realized we're going to lose all of our political power, so we have to leave the Union.
Wow.
So they were forced out of the Union, is essentially what I'm saying, and that's kind of what's left out of the history books, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. So let's just put yourself at that time. If you were the leader, what would you have done differently that could have prevented this war?
If you mean if I was the president of the
Yeah, like
United
let's
States,
say you're the president, and before succession or succeeding, I should say, what would you have done differently that could have prevented a split and a war?
so if I'm Buchanan or if I'm Abraham Lincoln,
Yeah,
okay,
essentially.
okay. Well, I'll say this. I don't really see Abraham Lincoln doing anything different, so I'm going to just put myself in the footsteps of kind of. Well, I guess I'll have to use myself as Abraham Lincoln because that's kind of the reason they left.
Yeah,
um, I think giving the South the Crittenden Compromise, not the Corwin Amendment, the Crittenden Compromise, which would have given them certain constitutional guarantees and regarding political representation and the issue of slavery. That would have been one step in the right direction. Um, the stubborn refusal to evacuate the forts in the South, specifically Fort Barrancas, Fort Pickens, and Fort Sumter, I would have not gone for that policy because that was obviously going to provoke some kind of conflict. Um, I think again, the southern states, I don't think could have lasted long term, especially well, in the southern states, especially South Carolina, realized this. They were not going to be able to last long term if they did not get the support of the states of Virginia, Tennessee, Arkansas, and North Carolina. All of those states left the Union after Fort Sumter because Abraham Lincoln called forward 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion in the southern states. And those states did not want to go to war with their fellow Southerners, so they left the Union after Fort Sumter. So those states would have remained in the Union if Fort Sumter had not occurred. So if I was Abraham Lincoln, I would do everything in my power to keep those states in the Union. I would not call forward 75,000 volunteers, certainly to invade the South, to invade my own country.
yeah,
Instead, I would try and come to the negotiating table and I would try to alleviate Southern worries over, again, their political representation, their sovereignty, and the issue of slavery. I would not be willing to go to war and kill 600,000 Americans over the issue of slavery.
yeah. So, one last question before we talk about your future projects with Red Wave America. People say how Abraham Lincoln was this goat, this great president who he's known for freeing the slaves and everything. Personally, for you, what do you think of Abraham Lincoln?
I have a complicated view on him. I think that he and his party did a lot to provoke the war. Um, I think that his handling of the war was particularly atrocious. Um, he was not a good military manager. He should have left things to his generals. Not he should not have interfered with the affairs of the military. Because pretty much every disaster that happened during the war for the North, Manassas, uh, Chancellorsville, Fredericksburg, uh, the Peninsula Campaign, the Red River Campaign out west, all of these large disasters that occurred for the North were kind of the cause of, or rather, the result of political interference from the Republican Party, but more specifically, Abraham Lincoln. Uh, So he was an incompetent military manager by all accounts. I mean, his military experience before the war, he was briefly a lieutenant of militia during the Black Hawk War. By the other hand, Jefferson Davis, president of the South, he was Secretary of War. He was a colonel in the U.S. Army during the Mexican-American War. He had a large amount of military experience, so he was a little bit better when it came to managing military affairs. A large portion, I think, why the South did so good during the war is actually because of Davis. On the other hand, a lot of the military failures of the North, I think, are a result of Abraham Lincoln's incompetence. He also did absolutely violate the Constitution on several occasions. Suspended the writ of habeas corpus without the approval of Congress, which again violates the Constitution. Uh, so, with that in mind, I have a very negative opinion of him. I think his management of the war was atrocious. I think I blame him in large part for why the war occurred. There were several courses of action that could have prevented a war. And like I said, I don't care if the war didn't happen, if the North could not have gotten their way politically. I don't think or rather, the Republican Party could not have gotten their way politically. I don't think pursuing a political policy of abolition was worth the deaths of 600,000 Americans.
I agree. So, on
So,
a scale of 1 to 45 different people who've been presidents of the United States, what would you rank Abraham Lincoln? One being the
towards the bottom.
greatest.
Towards the bottom, I guess. I don't know if I'd say he's quite 45, but he's more.
That's Joe
I mean,
Biden.
I'd say FDR and LBJ and them are a little worse.
Oh, yeah,
But he's
definitely.
definitely towards the bottom, and mainly the main reason I say that is less because of he violated the Constitution. I mean, yeah, he did, but yeah, I get it. It's during a war; some of those things are necessary, but more or less because of his management of the war. Again, he was militarily incompetent, and yet he tried so hard to meddle in the affairs of the army, and it led to a lot of deaths. Of Union soldiers, which were completely unnecessary. So for that, I would rank him pretty low.
Very low. Okay. You mentioned FDR, so you don't like that guy. It would be interesting to do a World War II discussion video with you in the later future.
Oh
Because
yeah,
a lot of people like FDR. I personally, I don't. I mean, I don't think he was the worst president, but I don't think he was the greatest either. So, but that would be an interesting topic for another day.
oh yeah.
So, yes, thank you for talking about the Civil War. Real quick, though, I want to go over a preview on a future project at Red Wave America that you are starting up. At the moment, I don't know what we're calling it. I had the Civil War history thing. I don't know how many episodes it's going to take you to go over the Civil War. You can do as many episodes as you want. That's up to you. Um, I have it to where I'm going to try to get them out every Friday. So all you have to do is just record, and then I would just edit them and try to get them out every Friday. If you're able to do it like that once a week, that's up to you,
All right.
or once every 2 weeks.
Yeah, I could do something like that. I would imagine most of the episodes, because this is a political channel, won't be so much military focused. They'll probably be more political focused.
Yeah.
So,
How many episodes do you think you could do it in?
I mean, depends on what's discussed. I'll talk to you about that.
Yeah,
Probably not more than 5, I wouldn't imagine.
not more than 5. How long do you think they'd be? Like around 20, 30 minutes?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. Okay. And then if you even want to invite someone on that show to talk to, you can. I mean, it's really just you. You're in charge of it. So, and then
Okay.
after that, maybe you could even do a World War II series if you're interested in
Yeah, I
that
could
too.
discuss that. My opinions on World War II are very complicated, probably even more so than my opinions on the Civil War.
Well,
Um, so,
I would love to hear it. Uh, well, thank you for watching Red Wave America, another awesome video. And thank you, Scott, for your time. God
yep,
bless.
no problem. Yep.